December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, 0755 hours. The first wave of Japanese bombers screamed across Oahu, turning the American Pacific Fleet into a cemetery of twisted steel and burning oil. Battleships capsized, men drowned in flaming water. The world watched in horror as the United States Navy suffered its most devastating defeat. In Tokyo, Admiral Yamamoto's staff celebrated what they believed was a crushing victory. The American surface fleet lay in ruins. Japan now controlled the Pacific. But in the chaos and smoke of that terrible morning, 52 American submarines slipped quietly away from their moorings, submerging into the dark waters where no Japanese bomb could reach them. These ghost ships, dismissed by Japanese Naval Command as ineffective relics of outdated warfare, would become the silent executioners of the entire Japanese Empire. What followed was not just a war, it was a systematic strangulation. A slow-motion apocalypse that would see the third largest merchant fleet in the world simply vanish beneath the waves, taking with it every drop of oil, every grain of rice, and every bullet that Japan needed to survive. The Japanese High Command laughed at American submarines in 1941. By 1945, they would be begging for mercy from an enemy they could not see, could not hear, and could not stop. If stories like this make you feel the heartbeat of history, subscribe and join us as we uncover what the world tried to forget. The USS Wahoo cut through the black waters of the Pacific on January 26, 1943, her diesel engines pushing her toward the Japanese-held coast of New Guinea. Inside the cramped control room, Lieutenant Commander Dudley Morton stood over the navigation charts, his eyes burning with an intensity that made his crew both terrified and inspired. Morton was different from other submarine captains. While most commanders in the early war years treated their submarines as scouts, sneaking around the edges of Japanese convoys and taking cautious shots from maximum range, Morton hunted like a wolf. He took Wahoo directly into the throat of enemy formations, firing torpedoes at point-blank range, surfacing to finish off survivors with his deck gun, turning his submarine into a surface raider that operated with shocking aggression. His executive officer, Richard O'Kane, shared this appetite for blood. Together, they would rewrite the book on submarine warfare, but their success came at a price that would haunt both men until their final days. The convoy appeared on the horizon just after dawn. 6 Japanese freighters, heavy with supplies destined for the starving garrisons in New Guinea, escorted by 2 destroyers. Standard doctrine called for a submerged approach, a single spread of torpedoes, then immediate retreat to deep water. Morton did the opposite. He surfaced Wahoo in broad daylight, running straight at the convoy at full speed, closing to less than 200 yards before crash diving beneath the nearest destroyer. The Japanese escorts erupted in confusion. No American submarine had ever done anything like this. The boldness was insane. It was also devastatingly effective. Morton fired 6 torpedoes in 45 seconds, hitting 4 of the 6 freighters. 2 exploded immediately, breaking in half and sliding beneath the surface in less than 3 minutes. The other 2 burned, their crews abandoning ship as secondary explosions tore through their cargo holds. Morton surfaced again, circling the sinking ships, his deck gun crew massacring the lifeboats. It was brutal. It was merciless. It was exactly what Japan had been doing to Allied forces across Asia for 2 years. O'Kane watched through the periscope, his face pale, as Japanese sailors drowned screaming in the oil-slicked water. He would later write that this moment changed something fundamental in how he viewed the war. There would be no mercy. There would be no restraint. This was extermination. But Morton's aggressive tactics revealed a terrifying problem that threatened to cripple the entire American submarine campaign before it could begin. Of the 6 torpedoes Morton fired at that convoy, 4 should have hit. 2 actually exploded. The other 2 struck their targets with a dull metallic thud and fell away, their warheads failing to detonate. This was not an isolated incident. Across the Pacific, American submarines were reporting the same nightmare. Torpedoes that ran too deep, passing harmlessly beneath enemy hulls. Torpedoes that struck dead center and bounced off without exploding. Torpedoes that ran in circles, chasing their own submarines. The Mark 14 torpedo, the primary weapon of the American submarine fleet, was a catastrophic failure. Its magnetic influence exploder, designed to detonate beneath the keel of enemy ships, was so sensitive it triggered prematurely or not at all. Its contact exploder, meant as a backup, crumpled on impact instead of firing. Its depth control mechanism was miscalibrated, causing torpedoes to run 11 feet deeper than set. The Bureau of Ordnance in Washington refused to believe the reports. They insisted the weapons were perfect. The problem, they claimed, was the submarine captains. Too timid, too inexperienced, not aggressive enough. The reality was exactly the opposite. American submarine commanders were risking everything to get close enough for killing shots, only to watch their torpedoes fail again and again. The psychological toll was devastating. Imagine stalking a convoy for 3 days, dodging destroyer patrols, calculating firing solutions with mathematical precision, finally achieving perfect position at lethal range, firing your torpedoes, watching them track perfectly toward the target. Impact. Nothing. Just a hollow thud as thousands of hours of effort dissolve into failure. Then the destroyers turn toward you, their screws churning the water as they race to drop depth charges on your position. You dive deep, listening to the escorts hunting above, knowing your torpedoes betrayed you, wondering if you will survive the counterattack, questioning whether your next shot will work or whether you will die because the weapons you trusted are fundamentally broken. This was the reality for American submariners in the first 18 months of the war. Commander Lawson Ramage understood this torture intimately. On August 31, 1942, he took USS Trout into the Truk Lagoon, the massive Japanese naval base that served as the enemy's Gibraltar in the Pacific. Trout penetrated the harbor defenses at night, navigating through minefields and anti-submarine nets, achieving what should have been impossible. Inside the lagoon sat the pride of the Japanese fleet: cruisers, carriers, destroyers, enough firepower to level a continent. Ramage lined up on a heavy cruiser anchored less than 800 yards away. He could see sailors walking her decks. At this range, missing was impossible. He fired 4 torpedoes. All 4 struck the cruiser's hull with perfect precision. None exploded. The cruiser sat there undamaged, probably not even aware it had been attacked. Ramage fired 2 more torpedoes at a nearby destroyer. Both hit. Both failed to detonate. He had 6 perfect shots at point-blank range. 6 hits, 0 explosions. Then the alarm sounded across Truk. The Japanese realized an American submarine had penetrated their defenses. Every escort in the harbor converged on Trout's position. Ramage dived, pushing his boat to test depth as the first depth charges began detonating. For 9 hours, Japanese escorts hunted Trout through the lagoon, dropping over 200 depth charges. The hull plates buckled. Light bulbs shattered. Men bled from their ears as the concussions hammered the submarine. Ramage sat in the control room, stone-faced, listening to his boat being slowly destroyed, knowing that if his torpedoes had worked, he would have crippled the Japanese fleet and been safely gone. Instead, he was fighting for survival because the Bureau of Ordnance refused to admit their weapons were defective. The submarine force began testing their own torpedoes, conducting unauthorized experiments that violated direct orders from Washington. They discovered the depth control problem first. Torpedoes were running exactly 11 feet deeper than their settings indicated. Captains started compensating, manually adjusting their calculations. Hit rates improved slightly. Then they began removing the magnetic exploders entirely, relying only on contact detonation. Washington was furious. The Bureau of Ordnance threatened court-martials. Submarine commanders ignored them. The war was more important than bureaucratic pride. By mid-1943, most submarines in the Pacific were operating with modified torpedoes, exploders removed or bypassed, running shallower than their official settings, using tactics that headquarters considered violations of protocol. The hit rate climbed from 18% to nearly 60%. Japanese shipping losses began to accelerate. If you were in that submarine, would you survive the silent hunt at sea? Comment: I would try. Tokyo initially dismissed the submarine threat as negligible. Japanese naval doctrine focused entirely on the decisive surface battle, the climactic fleet engagement where battleships and carriers would determine victory. Submarines were considered defensive weapons, useful for scouting and perhaps harassing enemy fleets, but not capable of winning wars. This thinking was catastrophically wrong. Japan was an island nation that imported everything: oil from the Dutch East Indies, iron from Manchuria, rice from Indochina, rubber from Malaya. Every resource that sustained the war effort had to travel by ship. The Japanese merchant marine in December 1941 totaled approximately 6 million tons of shipping. This sounds massive, but Japan needed at least 10 million tons to sustain both civilian needs and military operations. They were already operating at a deficit, gambling that captured territories would provide enough resources to offset the shortfall. The plan required Japanese merchant ships to run constant supply lines across thousands of miles of ocean. It required those ships to arrive safely. It required the supply lines to remain unbroken. American submarines turned this requirement into Japan's death sentence. The USS Silversides departed Pearl Harbor on April 30th, 1942, under the command of Lieutenant Commander Creed Burlingame. Her mission was simple: transit to the Japanese-controlled waters around Tokyo Bay and sink everything that moved. No restrictions, no mercy. Commerce warfare in its purest form. Silversides arrived on station in late May, just as a Japanese convoy departed Yokohama carrying industrial equipment and ammunition to the South Pacific. Burlingame tracked the convoy for 6 hours, waiting for nightfall, then surfaced and raced ahead of the formation. At 2200 hours, he positioned Silversides between the convoy and the coast, backlit the lead freighter against the glow of shore lights, and fired 4 torpedoes from 1,400 yards. 2 hit. The freighter, loaded with ammunition, detonated in a fireball visible from shore. The explosion was so massive it broke windows in Yokohama, 15 miles away. The escort scattered in panic, dropping depth charges randomly, hitting nothing. Burlingame calmly reloaded, selected his next target, and fired again. 3 more hits, 2 more ships sinking. By dawn, 5 Japanese freighters lay on the bottom. Silversides slipped away without taking a single depth charge. The patrol lasted 60 days. Silversides sank 14 ships. Over 70,000 tons of Japanese shipping simply ceased to exist. 1 submarine. 60 days. The economic equivalent of losing an entire port city. The Japanese High Command began to realize they had a serious problem. Merchant ship losses in the first year of the war totaled 1.5 million tons. This was sustainable, barely, if construction could replace losses. But American submarines were becoming more aggressive, more skilled, more numerous. New Gato-class submarines were entering service at a rate of 3 per month. Each one carried 24 torpedoes. Each one could stay at sea for 75 days. Each one operated with near impunity because Japanese anti-submarine warfare was, by any measure, pathetically inadequate. Japan entered the war with a merchant marine designed for peacetime coastal trade. Their escorts were few and poorly equipped. Their sonar technology was primitive. Their depth charges were underpowered. Their convoy doctrine was almost non-existent. Japanese merchant captains sailed independently, relying on speed and luck rather than coordinated protection. American submarines slaughtered them. The USS Flasher slipped through the Makassar Strait on December 4, 1944, hunting for targets in the narrow waters between Borneo and Sulawesi. Commander George Grider brought Flasher to periscope depth as morning light filtered through the tropical haze. What he saw made his heart race. Stretching across the horizon, the largest Japanese convoy he had ever encountered, 30 ships, tankers, freighters, troop transports, escorted by at least 6 destroyers and several smaller patrol craft. This was the kind of target that submarine captains dreamed about. It was also the kind of target that got submarines killed. Grider called his officers to the control room. The attack plan was insane. Flasher would penetrate the convoy screen at periscope depth, fire torpedoes from inside the formation, then crash dive beneath the convoy and escape out the back before the escorts could react. One mistake, one equipment failure, one unlucky detection, and Flasher would be obliterated. Grider ordered the attack. Flasher moved like a ghost through the screening destroyers, her periscope barely breaking the surface, her electric motors running silent. Grider positioned her in the center of the convoy formation, surrounded by Japanese ships on all sides. He selected the largest tanker, a massive vessel riding low in the water, obviously fully loaded with aviation fuel. Range 1,600 yards. Firing solution perfect. He fired 6 torpedoes in a spread pattern. Flasher immediately swung to target a second tanker, 3 more torpedoes away, then crash dive, full down angle, emergency dive to 400 feet. The first torpedoes struck while Flasher was still descending. The tanker exploded with such force that the shockwave slammed Flasher sideways, throwing men from their feet, shattering gauges in the control room. Grider could hear the tanker breaking apart through the hull. Then the second tanker detonated. This explosion was even larger. Aviation fuel ignited in a fireball that consumed 3 nearby freighters. The convoy dissolved into chaos. Ships scattered in every direction, colliding with each other, some trying to flee, others dead in the water. The escort destroyers raced toward where Flasher had been, dropping depth charges on empty water. Flasher was already beneath the convoy, running silent at 400 feet, heading for open ocean. When Grider brought Flasher back to periscope depth 3 hours later, the ocean was empty except for wreckage and floating bodies. He had sunk 2 tankers totaling 26,000 tons and damaged at least 4 other ships. More importantly, those tankers contained hundreds of thousands of gallons of aviation fuel destined for Japanese air bases in the Philippines. Without that fuel, Japanese aircraft would be grounded. Without air cover, Japanese positions would fall. One submarine attack had just changed the strategic balance of an entire theater of war. This was happening every day across the Pacific. Japanese logistics were collapsing. By 1943, the Mark 14 torpedo problems were finally being solved. The depth control was fixed. The contact exploder was redesigned. The magnetic exploder was either fixed or removed depending on the captain's preference. American submarines suddenly had weapons that actually worked. The kill rate exploded. Japanese merchant shipping losses in 1943 totaled 1.8 million tons. In 1944, that number jumped to 3.9 million tons. Japan was losing ships faster than they could possibly build replacements. Their shipyards were producing about 300,000 tons of new merchant shipping per year. They were losing 325,000 tons per month. The mathematics were unsustainable, inevitable, fatal. The USS Tang prowled the waters off the Japanese coast on October 24, 1944, under the command of Richard O'Kane, the same executive officer who had served with Dudley Morton on Oahu. O'Kane had learned from Morton's aggression, but refined it with calculated precision. Tang had become the most successful American submarine in the Pacific, sinking over 100,000 tons of Japanese shipping in just 5 patrols. This 6th patrol would be Tang's last. O'Kane found a convoy hugging the Chinese coast, 12 freighters and 5 escorts. He attacked at night from the surface, racing between the escort screen and the convoy at flank speed, firing torpedoes at point-blank range. The first 6 torpedoes sank 3 freighters. O'Kane reloaded and attacked again, 3 more ships down. The escorts finally realized what was happening and converged on Tang's position. O'Kane ordered a crash dive but immediately reversed, surfacing to fire his last 2 torpedoes at another freighter. Both hit. The freighter exploded and sank. Tang had 1 torpedo remaining. O'Kane selected a transport ship as his final target. Range 1,000 yards. He fired. The torpedo launched normally, its wake visible in the moonlight, tracking toward the target. Then it curved. Slowly at first. Then accelerating, the torpedo turned in a massive arc, running in a complete circle. O'Kane saw it coming. He ordered emergency speed, trying to outrun his own weapon. Tang accelerated, her diesels screaming. The torpedo was faster. It struck Tang's stern at 2,330 hours. The explosion tore off the submarine's tail, flooding the after compartments instantly. 9 men died in the initial blast. Tang sank in seconds, plunging to the bottom in 180 feet of water. 78 men were on board. 9 escaped from the forward torpedo room using Momsen lungs, primitive breathing devices that allowed emergency ascents. 5 survived the ascent. Richard O'Kane, the most lethal submarine captain in American history, spent the rest of the war in a Japanese prison camp, tortured repeatedly, barely surviving. He had sunk 24 Japanese ships totaling over 227,000 tons. His final victim was his own submarine, killed by a defective torpedo that may have been damaged in an earlier attack or may have simply been another failure of American ordnance. The irony was crushing. But Tang's sacrifice was not meaningless. By late 1944, Japanese industry was shutting down from lack of raw materials. Steel production dropped 70%. Oil imports fell 90%. Food shipments from Southeast Asia, which fed millions of Japanese civilians, simply stopped arriving. Starvation spread through Japanese cities. Factories closed. The war machine ground to a halt. The combined fleet, the pride of Japanese naval power, sat idle in port because there was no fuel to operate. The once mighty navy that had terrorized the Pacific had been reduced to immobile steel sculptures, slowly rusting while American submarines continued their relentless hunt. The USS Archerfish departed Guam on November 28, 1944, commanded by Joseph Enright. Her patrol area was the waters south of Tokyo Bay, hunting for targets of opportunity. On the evening of November 28th, Archerfish detected a large contact on radar. Enright brought his boat to periscope depth and could not believe what he saw. An aircraft carrier, massive, modern, escorted by 3 destroyers but running at high speed, zigzagging, clearly trying to outrun any submarine threat. This was the Shinano, the largest aircraft carrier ever built, displacing 72,000 tons, recently completed, and now conducting her maiden voyage to final fitting out at Curie. She was supposed to be unsinkable. Her designers had incorporated every lesson learned from previous carrier losses: armored flight deck, watertight compartments, damage control systems beyond anything previously attempted. The Japanese Navy believed Shinano was invulnerable to submarine attack. Enright chased Shinano for 6 hours. The carrier was faster than Archerfish's submerged speed, pulling away despite Enright's best efforts. But Shinano's captain made a critical error. He maintained a predictable zigzag pattern, changing course at regular intervals, assuming no submarine could keep up. Enright plotted the pattern, predicted where Shinano would be, and positioned Archerfish ahead of the carrier's track. At 0317 hours on November 29th, Shinano ran directly into Enright's firing solution, range 1,400 yards. Enright fired 6 torpedoes. 4 struck Shinano's starboard side in quick succession. The explosions tore massive holes below the waterline. Shinano's damage control team sprang into action, but the carrier was so new that many systems were not fully operational. Watertight doors did not seal properly. Pumps failed. Water flooded into compartments that should have remained dry. The carrier began listing. Her captain refused to believe his ship was in serious danger. He maintained course and speed, believing Shinano could absorb the damage and reach port. He was wrong. The flooding accelerated. By 0600 hours, Shinano was listing 30 degrees. At 10:15 hours, the massive carrier rolled over and sank, taking 1,435 men with her. She had been in commission for 10 days. Archerfish had achieved what every submarine captain dreamed of, a carrier kill, the largest warship ever sunk by a submarine. Japanese Naval Command tried to keep Shinano's loss secret. They failed. American intelligence intercepted the communications. The news spread through the submarine force like electricity. If an aircraft carrier, the most valuable and heavily protected target in naval warfare, could be sunk on its maiden voyage, nothing was safe. The psychological impact on the Japanese Navy was devastating. Carrier operations became almost impossible. Every time a major warship left port, submarines were waiting. The ocean had become a killing field where Japanese ships entered but rarely returned. The human cost of this campaign was staggering on both sides. American submarines lost 52 boats during the war. 3,505 submariners died, the highest casualty rate of any branch of the American military. 16% of the men who served in submarines never came home. They died in steel coffins at the bottom of the Pacific, crushed by depth charges, trapped in flooded compartments, suffocating as their oxygen ran out. The Japanese lost 2,346 merchant ships, totaling 8.9 million tons. Estimates suggest between 100,000 and 200,000 Japanese merchant mariners died. This does not include the millions of Japanese civilians who starved because food shipments never arrived, or the soldiers who died in isolated garrisons because ammunition and reinforcements could not reach them. The submarine campaign killed more Japanese than the atomic bombs, though it did so slowly, invisibly, over 4 years of relentless attrition. The USS Barb conducted one of the most audacious operations in submarine history in July 1945. Commander Eugene Fluckey brought Barb into the waters off the coast of Karafuto, the Japanese-controlled southern portion of Sakhalin Island. Fluckey had already established himself as one of the most aggressive submarine captains in the Pacific, sinking 17 ships on previous patrols. But he wanted to do something unprecedented. He wanted to attack targets on land. Barb's crew manufactured rockets from spare parts and scrap metal, mounting them on the submarine's deck. On July 22nd, Barb surfaced offshore and launched a barrage of rockets at Japanese installations on Karafuto. The attack was so unexpected that the Japanese did not respond for several minutes. By then, Barb had submerged and escaped, but Fluckey was not finished. On July 23rd, Fluckey landed a shore party of 8 volunteers on the Japanese coast. Their mission was to blow up a railroad. The team crept inland, located a rail line, and planted demolition charges. They returned to the beach, swam back to Barb, and watched as a Japanese train approached the demolition zone. The charges detonated directly under the locomotive. The train derailed and exploded, probably carrying ammunition or fuel. Barb became the only American submarine in history to sink a train. The audacity was stunning. The message was clear. Nowhere in the Japanese Empire was safe. American submarines could strike anywhere, anytime, against any target. By August 1945, the Japanese merchant marine had been functionally annihilated. Only 1.5 million tons of shipping remained operational, barely enough to support minimal coastal trade. The empire was starving. Industry had collapsed. The population was on the verge of mass famine. American submarines operating with near total freedom were running out of targets. Some patrols returned without firing a single torpedo because there were simply no Japanese ships left to sink. The naval blockade was complete. Japan was cut off from the resources that sustained life. The atomic bombs and Soviet invasion provided the final shock, but Japan was already dying from submarine-induced starvation. The war was over not because of any climactic battle, but because American submarines had methodically destroyed the logistical foundation of Japanese power. The final accounting is almost incomprehensible. American submarines, representing less than 2% of the U.S. Navy, sank 55% of all Japanese shipping lost during the war. They sank 1,114 Japanese merchant ships totaling 5.3 million tons. They sank 214 Japanese naval vessels, including 1 battleship, 8 aircraft carriers, and 11 cruisers. The economic value destroyed exceeded $10 billion in 1945 currency, equivalent to over $150 billion today. The strategic impact cannot be measured in numbers. Japan entered the war as an industrial power with the 3rd largest navy in the world. By 1945, Japan was a pre-industrial society on the brink of societal collapse. American submarines accomplished what the entire Allied surface fleet could not. They brought a maritime empire to its knees by cutting the sea lanes that gave it life. The crews who achieved this victory remain largely unknown. There were no triumphant parades for returning submarines, no newsreels celebrating their victories. They operated in secret, hunting alone, dying alone, succeeding alone. When they returned to port after 60 or 70-day patrols, they restocked, refueled, and returned to sea. No rest, no recognition, just back to the hunt. Many never spoke about their experiences. The psychological toll of stalking and killing other human beings, even enemy combatants, left scars that never healed. Richard O'Kane suffered nightmares for the rest of his life, haunted by the men he killed and the men he lost. Eugene Fluckey became a rear admiral, but carried the weight of every depth charge attack, every near miss, every moment where luck rather than skill determined survival. These men were not superhuman. They were ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances, doing a job so terrible and so necessary that it defied comprehension. The Japanese perspective is equally haunting. Merchant mariners watched their ships being systematically destroyed with no effective defense. They sailed knowing that every voyage might be their last, that an invisible enemy waited beneath the waves, that their death would come without warning. Japanese naval officers watched their merchant fleet vanish and could do nothing to stop it. They lacked the escorts. They lacked the technology. They lacked the doctrine. Their strategic planning had been so focused on offensive operations that they never prepared for defensive warfare. By the time they realized the magnitude of the submarine threat, it was too late. The damage was irreversible. The war was lost. In the final months of the war, Japanese submarines attempted to replicate American tactics, targeting Allied supply lines. They failed almost completely. American anti-submarine warfare was vastly superior. Convoy escorts were numerous and well-trained. Sonar technology was advanced. Air cover was omnipresent. Japanese submarines managed to sink only 184 Allied merchant ships during the entire war, a fraction of what American submarines achieved against Japan. The disparity highlights how completely the United States dominated undersea warfare. American submarines were not just weapons. They were precision instruments of economic destruction, wielded with calculation and maintained with industrial excellence that Japan could not match. The technological innovations that emerged from the submarine campaign transformed naval warfare. The Gato-class submarine became the template for all future diesel-electric submarines. Its combination of range, endurance, torpedo capacity, and crew habitability set standards that remained relevant for decades. The development of effective torpedoes, after the catastrophic failures of the Mark XIV, led to weapon systems that influenced naval ordnance design through the Cold War. The tactics pioneered by commanders like Morton, O'Kane, and Fluckey became doctrine studied by every submarine force in the world. The intelligence advantages gained through code breaking demonstrated the critical importance of signals intelligence in modern warfare. Ultra and Magic, the Allied code-breaking programs, provided American submarines with detailed information about Japanese convoy routes, schedules, and cargo. This intelligence allowed submarines to position themselves with devastating precision, ambushing convoys at predetermined intercept points. Japanese naval commanders never realized their codes were compromised. They changed their communication procedures multiple times, but never achieved security. American submarines always knew where to find targets. This advantage was decisive. The industrial capacity that supported the submarine campaign was equally important. American shipyards built 288 fleet submarines during the war, an average of one every 5 days. Each submarine represented thousands of tons of steel, miles of wiring, complex mechanical systems, and trained crews. The logistical infrastructure to maintain these submarines at forward bases across the Pacific was staggering. Repair facilities, fuel depots, torpedo storage, food supplies, spare parts, all had to be transported thousands of miles from the continental United States and kept operational under combat conditions. Japan attempted to build submarines at a similar pace, but managed only about 60 fleet submarines during the entire war. Their industrial capacity could not compete. Their logistics could not sustain extended operations. The outcome was predetermined by industrial mathematics long before the first shots were fired. The strategic implications echo through history. The submarine campaign against Japan demonstrated that modern industrial warfare is fundamentally about logistics. You can have the best soldiers, the most advanced weapons, the most brilliant strategies, but without the industrial and logistical support to sustain operations, you will lose. Japan learned this lesson in the most brutal way possible. Their military conquered vast territories, won stunning tactical victories, and fought with fanatical courage. None of it mattered because they could not move resources from where they existed to where they were needed. American submarines cut those movement routes. Everything else followed from that single strategic reality. The human dimension of this campaign deserves final reflection. Every ship that sank carried men who had families, dreams, fears. Every submarine that was lost held crews who believed in their mission and trusted their equipment. War reduces these individuals to statistics, numbers on damage reports, tonnage calculations, kill ratios, but each number represents a human being who experienced terror, pain, and death. The submarine war was particularly cruel because of its isolation. Surface battles at least offered the possibility of rescue. Air crews could bail out or ditch at sea. Submarine crews had no such options. When a submarine died, everyone on board died with it. Trapped in darkness, water flooding in, hull collapsing under pressure, knowing death was coming and being helpless to stop it. This was the reality for over 3,500 American submariners and tens of thousands of Japanese sailors. Their sacrifice deserves to be remembered not as abstract history, but as individual tragedies that collectively shape the world we inhabit. The legacy of the silent service, as American submarines were known, extends far beyond World War II. The tactics, technology, and traditions established during the Pacific Campaign influenced every subsequent submarine force. Nuclear submarines, ballistic missile submarines, attack submarines that hunted Soviet vessels during the Cold War all trace their lineage to the Gado-class boats that strangled Japan. The officers who commanded those submarines, the enlisted men who maintained them, the support personnel who kept them operational, created a culture of excellence that defined American naval power for generations. They proved that small forces, properly employed, could achieve strategic effects far beyond their size. They demonstrated that economic warfare, when executed with precision and persistence, could be more decisive than climactic battles. They showed that technology, training, and determination could overcome initial failures and achieve ultimate victory. The story of how Japan laughed at American submarines and then watched their entire fleet vanish is not simply a tale of military triumph. It is a case study in how initial impressions can be catastrophically wrong, how technological problems can be overcome through innovation and perseverance, how strategic blindness can doom even the most powerful nations, and how ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when necessity demands it. The Japanese High Command dismissed submarines as ineffective. They were wrong. American torpedoes failed for 2 years. They were fixed. Japan believed their empire could survive on captured resources. It could not. American submariners volunteered for the most dangerous service in the military. They succeeded beyond all expectations. In the end, the Pacific War was won by many forces: carrier task forces, marine assaults, army campaigns, strategic bombing. But the silent, invisible, relentless pressure of submarine warfare was the crushing grip that made all other victories possible. Japan could not supply its armies if the supply ships never arrived. It could not fuel its aircraft if the tankers were sunk. It could not feed its population if the rice convoys disappeared. American submarines ensured that none of these logistics succeeded. They turned the Pacific Ocean, which Japan considered its protective moat, into a graveyard that consumed Japanese power ship by ship, gallon by gallon, ton by ton, until nothing remained except the memory of an empire that once believed itself invincible. The final patrol reports from late 1945 make for haunting reading. Submarines prowling Japanese waters, searching for targets, finding nothing, empty seas, abandoned ports. a nation so thoroughly defeated that even the hunters had nothing left to hunt. The war ended not with a bang, but with a whimper, the sound of a submarine surfacing in waters that once teemed with enemy shipping and finding only silence. Japan laughed at American submarines in 1941. By 1945, there was nothing left to laugh about. The fleet had vanished, the empire had fallen, the submarines had won. If you want to discover more untold stories of naval warfare, strategic deception, and the engineering marvels that changed history, subscribe and join us as we continue to uncover the operations the world forgot. History is not just what happened, it is what we remember. And these stories, these men, these submarines deserve to be remembered.